when it comes to science, we are being very selectively fed all of the data on which we're making all of our decisions. When you preclude God from the discussion of science, and I remember back in high school approaching my 11th grade science teacher and say, why is it that we spend all this time in evolutionary theory and we spend no time in creation? And he says, yeah, okay, that's a fair question. A person desiring equity in what he was doing. And he said, okay, so we can teach creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All done. What else? And that is the problem. The problem is that all science is being approached as though the theory of evolution were an established fact, when in fact the actual evidence viewed by creation and evolution are identical. The evidences that are there are seen that are the same, and there's no disagreement on what the evidence is. The disagreement is on how we interpret it. And so as we look at it, some scientists, and great scientists, have always seen that God, the intelligent designer, is at the base of everything. And there are other people who, by nature of the fact that they don't want God to be an answer, have decided that that's not an acceptable answer, and therefore it's not an acceptable lens to view the evidence that they see. So they create all kinds of fantastic things. And when I say they're fantastic, I mean there's a basic 3-year-old understands real quickly that there are certain things like right and wrong in the world. And as you grow older and you become aware that buildings always have a builder, and you see the complexity and you see the straight line designs of certain things, you say, oh, that's man-made, that's not natural. Okay. But in the natural world, there are things that absolutely preclude the idea that God does not exist. For example, you've never seen a blueprint that happened by accident before a building was designed. DNA is the blueprint by which man is designed, and without DNA, you can't have life. There's a guy named Michael Behe who wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, and it's pretty amazing because he argues that not as a Christian, but he argues the fact that because Darwin thought that things came from simple things into more complex things, and that the survival of the fittest was the mode in which all of these things happen, Darwin could be excused perhaps for having that naive view of the world. But the reality is that the simple cell is anything but simple, and it all develops down into mitochondria and into the power. That's the power plant of the cell, and then all of the different ways in which the DNA affects what's being developed by the cell, and the production of proteins through the memory RNA strands that come off of the DNA section by section, so that they're able to produce the proper protein for the proper thing. The complexity of the simple cell is so complex that it's irreducible. There's no way that you can have one before another. So if the blueprint existed before the cell, but if they were created together, it makes sense. But if they weren't, there's no way for evolution to produce it. They can't produce one thing independent of another, because that thing would have no purpose. A blueprint has no purpose except to design a building. And to develop a blueprint by accident or as a part of the port, there's so much ridiculousness about the current theories of evolution and the idea that matter cannot be created or destroyed, but everything came from a big bang, which we go back and say, so the matter was all concentrated in a space like smaller than the head of a pin, and it blew up, and that's where all the matter in the universe came from. That makes sense, but where did the head of the pin come from? It's like everybody understands that things had a beginning. You can't look at the data on the universe and not understand that it has a timeline. It had a beginning and end, and so space and time come into existence about the same time. So at some point, time was created, and so was space created, and matter was created within space. So space, time, and matter have this incredible relationship that why they exist at all is not answerable by any even speculative religion. The idea that that life came from non-life. I mean, this was put away by people who realized that spontaneous generation was not a reality, was not a scientific idea. That always, when rags were left in a corner and flies resulted, it was because flies were there previously and laid some eggs. It wasn't because the rags in the corner would eventually produce flies. And yet that was the science at one point in our history. And we disabused ourselves of that notion only to resurrect it with the idea that evolution happened all by itself. It didn't need a designer. And then there's the concept of the idea that, well, God doesn't know what he's talking about, because even if God started the process, he used evolution to make it, and he used billions and billions of years. You realize how silly that idea is. The fact is this, that either the Bible is true, that sin that came into the world with Adam and Eve leads to death, by which evolution has to have in order to function. There has to be death and birth, and the cycle has to be going on prior to sin entering the world. So you either disbelieve that sin and death are connected. You don't believe that at all. So either God is to be trusted or he's not. And there's no reason to believe the fairy tales that would be the biblical account unless they're not fairy tales at all. They're actual truth from cover to cover, beginning to end. And everything that God says can be trusted. Now, personally, I would rather take an account of somebody that was an eyewitness to creation, of how it all began, than somebody who speculates that I don't want to believe the person who was there, so I'm going to dismiss all of that as even possible before I start looking for solutions. As a result, we find a very corrupted science and a very inadequate view of who we are, why we're here, and what this is all about. And the science will forever evade us, the real science. Okay, I'll talk to you later in the next video. Love you. Bye.